Hey everybody, welcome back to video game Esoterica and our continuing series on how to convert the Hyper Neo Geo 64 driving motherboard to use home console controls. So let's get right into this. It's been a long series and hopefully we can finish up on this video. What we're going to need to use is the following. We have our pin crimpers, we have some pliers, solder sucker, solder and wick, our multimeter, standard toolkit, we have our wire strippers, soldering iron, and most importantly a half-drank cup of coffee. Definitely need my coffee when I'm working on this. And we just made a quick map of where the buttons are going to go for this wheel, since the first wheel we had did not have that potentiometer inside. But just kind of feeling the wheel, I like to see what's comfortable on the buttons. I actually ended up using some switches on the back as opposed to the front for shift up and down. But what I do here is just make a quick map when I take all those screws out. Sometimes these screws aren't all the same length, so it's really easy to get them mixed up. So all I do is when I take everything apart, I just make a little screw map and tape everything down. That way I know where things go back when I'm done. But what I was having an issue was, I couldn't actually get the wheel apart. So what I decided to do was check under these little pads here for screws. I just use a pair of tweezers with a little flathead there, and you will see that as we take those off, all of those different pads to keep your table from scuffing have screw holes underneath them. So if you're never sure how to get something apart, if you've taken all the visible screws out, that's how it works. Now that we're inside, we're going to see we have a wiring harness for the potentiometer. We're also going to have a wiring harness for all the buttons that go into the wheel, and they hook up to this little USB board right here with all those leads. We're actually not going to use that. We're not going to need the USB controller because that's too much information. What we have right here in the potentiometer is we have our ground, we have our 5-volt lead, and then we have our data line. And then the other cable coming out is all the controls. But we can basically just remove this entire USB board because we're not going to be needing it. We're going to just go bare wire right into the PCB. So we'll just come in with our little snips here and we'll pop those off because, like I said, this board is good for testing to understand how things work, but as far as the actual project, we're not going to need that USB board whatsoever, so we'll just pull it. What I will check here is just to see where my ground is, because on the front of the board, all those wires are going to be labeled, but they don't say what they go for. So by using the colors as well as the multimeter, we know exactly where each lead is supposed to be. And what I'll do is just come in here and label all my different leads. They're very similar in color, and I don't really want to have to go into this wheel a second time to fix things. So the best thing to do is just to label all your leads when you're working on them. We've got power, ground, and data. Now we know when we're working on everything where those wires go and why they're doing that. But I was having a lot of issues getting the actual wheel plastic off the front. I took all the screws out and I couldn't get anything to come apart, so much so that I sliced underneath my fingernail. It made the project a lot worse. This sucks. Just be careful when you're working. But now that I have this other cable right here, we're getting all the leads we need, and we're not going to need that USB end anymore because we are going DB15 in, so we'll just come in with our snippers and pop that right off because it is no longer essential and we're just using this for the wiring. So as we unbraid that, we're going to see all the different leads inside. We need 3, and we have 3, actually 4, so we are good to go. We'll just leave that white one off to the side. What I will do is come in and check continuity across all the different wires. That way I know that everything's working in that cable. What I don't want to do is solder everything together and find out there's a broken lead somewhere in there. But what I'll do now is I'll just go ahead and tin my leads, that way that I can put them together. You're going to want to put solder on both ends. It's going to be a lot easier to get them soldered that way. But I'll just use my helping hand in here, and I'll come in and I'll paint some solder right on that, making that splice nice and solid. That way I know the signal is going through and it's not going to break as it's in that wheel turning around, because these wheels do move. And then I'll just come in, now that I've done all 3 of those wires, and check continuity on all of them just to make sure that everything is connected exactly how I expect it to be. And now that we know all that continuity is good, we can move on to the next step in the conversion process. And what I'm going to do down here off screen is I'm just going to solder these little bits of wire onto the wire coming out of the cable. The gauge isn't exactly what I like to work with when I use the DB15 port, so it's just going to help me out. But now that I have that taken care of, what you'll see here is that there is no strain relief on this cable. There is on one end, but I'm going to use that on the DB15 port. So by routing the cable through the plastic screw post, you're able to make sure that the strain goes onto the cable and not any of your solder joints. That way when that cable pulls, it's actually nice and tight in there and it's not going to break anything. Then I'll just come in with a little bit of heat shrink tube and wrap everything up. That way I know that those wires aren't going to get caught on anything or move around. It's just a nice way to make sure your work's as clean as possible. Not the best heat shrink tube I've ever done, but it's definitely going to protect all those cables inside of there. And now you'll see that that wheel is done as far as the potentiometer is concerned. Everything turns and we have our bare wire there that's able to be hooked up into the DB15 port. And what I discovered was there's screws under this little jewel cap. It didn't look like it moved. I had to look online, but now we know there's 4 screws down there, and I really didn't have to actually destroy my fingernail. But now that we're inside, we're going to see all these different micro switches. We have ABC, X, Y, Z, and then the 2 shoulder buttons. And we did decide to use the shoulder buttons on the back for shift up and shift down because I didn't actually notice those were there when I first got the wheel in. I never used this wheel before, so I wasn't sure. But taking a look with the multimeter, we're going to see that ground as well as the 5-volt are tied, but on the other end of the board, ground actually isn't tied together. So there's two different ground planes on this board, but we actually want to make a common ground because for view A and B, shift up and shift down, the Hyper Neo Geo uses one ground. So what we're going to need to do is just blob a little solder on here, and we're going to make ourselves a common ground chain. So using my helping hand, I'll just advance this little ground wire in, solder it over there, and I do apologize my hand's in the way here as I put that wire on, but I'm bridging these two sides of the PCB so that ground travels across both of them. That way I know that the ground chain is at least complete on that respect. And we have that little wire there, we'll have to route it through the wheel, but that is good to go. I'll just come in and check my continuity, and we'll see that we have continuity across that PCB, so we're good on that bridge. I'll just use these little tweezers here because I need to jump this little wire, and it gets quite hot when you're soldering, so using those tweezers I'm able to jump the view up and the view down ground, so we now have that ground chain completed as well. But we will see that we still have one more bridge to go because these planes aren't connected even on that side. So we're going to come in and put that last wire you see down there, and you will see that we have ground continuity across all the buttons we need on one signal line. What we're going to use for the cable here is I always save my broken things. It was a broken PlayStation 2 controller, and we're going to use that for all the wires we need inside. Routing it through the front, we're going to have all the signal wires and grounds that we need to hook up. I did this off screen because it was quite a pain having to route that cable through and solder. It just didn't work on camera. But now that we have all those different leads hooked up, we have all our live signals for all the buttons we're going to need for that wheel as well. I will say cable routing was a problem on this project. The wheel doesn't have much recess in there, but I was able to get everything back together and snake that cable through the bottom so that everything as it turns has enough strain relief. Just pop that jewel back on to cover the wires we don't need. That harness had more than I needed, so I just left them in there in case I wanted them in the future. You'll see that that cable does route right through the front of the wheel. All the buttons work, and all our wires are set up to be able to be connected to that DB15 port, including those back shift up and shift down. And what we do here is we just have to route the cable for the buttons through that potentiometer area. So we have one cable going through the telephone line, which is how the pedals hooked up originally, and we have another cable going through the top. The buttons on the front don't really have strain relief. I need to work on that, but the actual cable on the top does. You'll see here, all of those wires are ready to go. The wheel works and all the buttons are good. So on the next step right now, we're just going to wire everything up into the PCB, and we're going to test to make sure that it is working as we expect. So to marry the controls up, we use these two DB15 connectors. That way we have a quick disconnect between the controls and the board itself. And you're going to see right here, that cable is going to run into the wheel, and then it's going to dip down and go right into the pedals. So we have a quick disconnect on a DB15 connector to hook everything up. Unfortunately, we only have the pin out for the front 21-pin connecting harness, and that was not included in my purchase. So I had to wait for a month and a half for a wiring harness for this game to come in all the way from Germany. When it did come in, I was able to trace all the different leads back from those front connectors to the 32 and the 34-pin connectors. So I made this custom schematic showing what comes off the JAMA edge, as well as what comes off the 34 and the 32-pin connectors, and I made a pin out for all the different controls of the game. I will scan this if you're as foolish as I am and you want to convert this. You'll be able to know how to do it. And then for testing purposes, I use alligator clips to make sure all my signals are good. I cleaned this up outside of the video, but you know how to make the connectors. I've shown them in previous videos, so I just cleaned it up. Other than that, you will see here, I am using a flight stick. And that is because the potentiometer in that Microsoft wheel was too degraded to work. The potentiometers get worse over time because they're actually a friction surface, so the wheel would just pull hard to the right. I could correct it a little bit to the left, but the potentiometer just wanted to continually put me into the wall. So I grabbed a quick spare flight stick I had because we only need the X data for left and right, and you will see that the board is now working fine. We have gas, we have brake, we have control. I can now play the two Hyper Neo Geo 64 driving games at home and capture them for my season on the Hyper itself. I will say this was the most annoying conversion I've had to do. There was so much missing information, I had to make it up as we went along. But hey, it works. Thanks so much for watching. Stay tuned for our season on the Hyper Neo Geo 64. And we'll have more videos coming up soon. We really appreciate you watching this. Thanks so much. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Stupid wheel.